Welcome to the Standards Michigan weekly focused teleconference, where the door is open to discuss the week's work, but also we expand upon the underlying philosophy and strategy that guides our work. Today, the door is open from the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. We schedule these open teleconferences at a time when the work week winds down and when our more reflective discussions do not crowd our production calendars, what we do to write, code, and get votes in the middle part of the week. As Mike likes to say, writing code and getting votes is what we do to pay the rent. The fundamental currency of what we do is ideas, getting them supported with data and onto the agendas of technical and business standards development committees, more or less on an hourly basis. Thus our reference to our core competency, streaming advocacy. Streaming regulation requires streaming advocacy. We always prefer that these Friday teleconferences be more of discussion than a lecture. We do post almost all of them on our YouTube channel, and we get about 25 views per week. Enough, we think, to meet an obligation to be open, transparent, and accessible, as well as open to challenges to our priorities. As we indicated last week, this week's teleconference is a pre-record. We are here at the Ross School of Business a day ahead of time, and 2 days after the July construction report was released by the U.S. Census Bureau. I'll now turn the call over to Mike, who will continue with our focus on the U.S. Census Bureau's construction spending report for July, with special attention to its estimate of the construction spend rate by the education and healthcare facilities industry. Mike?
Thanks very much, Christine. It seems every week that we set new records for how much we can get done in the time that's allowed to actually explain what we're doing. As I like to say, we're a doing shop, we're not a talking shop. So you might have seen in our one of our introductory websites that our new descriptive is discipline, speed, and results. We believe that the trade associations are in a better position to do the education. We are tempted, we are in the education industry, and of course we are tempted to teach. Well, we have to do here, and so most of our focus is in what we call the prosaic term, writing code and getting votes, as Christine had said. So that's my apology for not these being 70% polished, because we were sacrificing content and speed to polish, and I think it's worked so far. A couple other modifications since our scripts were written is that both Christine and I had a difficulty getting to the Ross School of Business, and so we're actually off-site in a place where we can actually get to the internet and do our presentation for this week. So what I now have on the screen is something that I intended to replace actually being being on site, and this is the University of Iowa. This is actually a construction camp. This is where they're at right now, I believe. And what we'll do is we're going to run through the time lapse. So as you can see up here on the screen, this is what is it, 11:46. They're an hour behind us here in Ann Arbor. So let's see how it looked for them over what apparently is the better part of 2 years. I picked this one specifically so that you could understand one of the advocacy projects we have been running for about 1.5 years is one where we try to get the structural engineering tables of the International Building Code and the Structural Engineering Institute to harmonize a little bit better. I'm going to stop it right about here. I'm going to stop it right about, if I can stop it right there. Maybe it's not going to let me. So I'll just leave it. I want you to pay attention to the structural members that are going in place as this building is being built, because that's an area where generally it's part of the domain of the first cost enterprises in our industry. What we're doing there looks like, I guess I was able to stop it, and I'll draw your attention to it. By making distinctions between laboratories, light use laboratories versus laboratories intended for use by federal research projects, we believe that we can craft a better agreement between structural engineering rules for live loading and the occupancies as defined by the International Building Code. So I'll point that out. It's not a done deal, but it is on the agenda of the 2018 International Building Code Committees. We've had a couple meetings on it. It seems to be going our way, but it's very complicated. But the outcome, at best, I suppose, is within the next 5 years, some of the governing assumptions that structural engineers make about the loading here, and I think you're seeing a fair amount of concrete, will be modified somewhat. Now, this is actually a hospital, but what we discovered is that in the International Building Code, they don't make a distinction between laboratories and hospitals that are generally for clinical use versus laboratories in some of our facilities which are used for animal research, very heavy equipment, and we want to make that distinction. It looks like that's going our way. How exactly that will get conveyed into the Structural Engineering Institute guidance, we don't know, but we know that SEI does look to the International Building Code to define its spaces and its use types. So we think that it will probably put more downward pressure where there was excess, and where there was not enough structural engineering for live loading, it will raise it. So we think we're essentially right-sizing the structural for a large class of facilities in our industry, which is research laboratories and healthcare facilities. So that I'll put that down, and that'll be this week's on-site work point video, and let's get down to our numbers. We like to say that these are our marquee numbers. That's why we have a little bit of theatrics here. This can be a dry subject. So the number we got on Tuesday, or was it Monday? Tuesday, was that public construction for educational. Let me put a little spotlight on this so you can see where I'm at. So educational construction was at a seasonally adjusted annual rate of $66.4 billion, up 3.5%. Now, that asterisk refers to some non-agreement. The numbers are generally close, but they do condition some of these estimates. If you're watching them month to month like we are, then there's a recognition that they don't always jive. These numbers do depend upon, as I've been told, Dodge Analytics. They also the validity of this data also hangs upon the participation of our industry. So even though we were not able to get the Census Bureau or Dodge Analytics here at this conference call, and arguably we're ahead of a holiday weekend, and many offices are already clearing out. Of course, college campuses aren't because other students are moving in. But that much said, we are seeing what they've asked us to do is to ask our colleagues when they receive the surveys, please fill them out so they can get better data. So we feel that since we're using their data every month to inform some of our agenda and some of our priorities, that we would like to remind our colleagues out there to respond to the surveys by the Census Bureau and Dodge Analytics. So that number now, that number is actually a number that that's one part of it that deals with public construction. So what you see here, if I drill down a little bit deeper, if I can get Prezi to respond, is that 66.3 number was right there. This is public construction. There's also private construction, and this is interesting because what is done in this analysis is that it may well be this 18.3 billion number is private construction. That could be technical schools, that could be for-profit, that could be art museums. Sometimes there's a educational component to art museums, and when I've talked to the Census Bureau on this, they struggle with it also. It's the best data we have, and once again, they see what we see, is that when you look at the stuff every month, at some point you start to be able to make certain assumptions about its validity. So that's one of the reasons why we apply this discipline of making sure we come back to this stuff every month to make sure our numbers we can find the perturbations, what are the abnormalities in our data, even as we try to get the data more granular. So when you add these two numbers up, there's public construction and private construction, you get a number like $84.4 billion. So that's the rate at which our industry is building new square footage or renovating square footage over $75,000. So I try to give some sense of scale to these numbers, and this is so this is the number I like to point out. I believe I freshened up this number. So we are, so you say public education. First of all, let's say it's important for you to understand that we break out the healthcare component because a lot of healthcare is being built by the private sector. We believe that we would be part of the public health care. So what this number here means is it's likely the construction that's just for university-affiliated healthcare systems. We've talked a little bit in the past. There is a trade association for every segment of an organization chart in the education industry. And so there is actually American Association of University Affiliated Hospitals, and this is what Dodge Analytics and the Census Department is tracking at the rate at which new square footage was added or square footage over $75,000 was renovated. So it's a relatively small comparison to the education square footage, but it's noteworthy. I want to make sure that you understand that that we're considering only university-affiliated healthcare systems. But getting back to the educational square footage, this number is both K-12 as well as business occupancies, commercial occupancies. Many of you may already know that in the K-12, that's a certain risk class. That's really what they call schools, students up to, I believe, 18 years of age. That's a particularly sensitive area for the fire marshals to get students that have a certain maturity level to get out. I'm not saying that all students that enroll as freshmen in college are mature, but the codes recognize the difference between K-12 young infants, daycare, and the students up to age 18, and what goes on in higher education. It's a separate discussion about the risk aggregations in dormitories. Finally, this is the private construction spend, which we're including as part of education generally. So that's a little bit different than how we treated this number. But long story short, we see this number 84.3, and that's this number. Remember, the Census Department takes two months to look over, so this is backward-looking data back about 2 months. So let's move on, shall we? Let's see if I can get my Prezi going to the next slide. Oh, did I say that the rate at which we're constructing is slightly greater than the annual revenue of Microsoft and slightly lower than the annual revenue of Boeing? So imagine how much money is coming in over the transom for both Microsoft and Boeing every year, and that's how much new stuff, that's how much new construction our industry is engaged in. I'm revisiting, to give some scale to our numbers. Once again, this is kind of a macroeconomic view. I want us to see where we fit in the larger picture. We've always used, in some presentations in the past, we have used clickers to make this subject a little bit more lively. So we pose some questions here, just so you know, some carefully crafted questions to make a rhetorical point. And here's a rhetorical point. The entire European Union gross domestic product is about 16.4 trillion. I looked at that last year, probably up a little bit. The new number for U.S. gross domestic product is 17.4 trillion. And China's gross domestic product is about 10. I looked at the numbers last night. I didn't put them on this Prezi, but these are roughly the same numbers. Market capitalization and the gross domestic product are different. So those of you who have been following the trends in the equity markets, that might be of interest to you. D is roughly our industry's about the size of the entire gross domestic product of Mexico. The facilities only components at 303 billion, and of course this is always an important number. How much is the world making? And it's 75 trillion. Okay, so I have some other numbers here, numbers to steer by, so to say. I mentioned China's growth, and a lot of problems are solved with growth. I'm not sure if our industry has the same dynamic with respect to economic growth. Maybe if it did, it would be our costs would be, and the value might be correlate a little bit more change in the economy. And there seems to be a bit of a delay effect there, as you probably all know. So assuming that growth solves a lot of problems, we're not getting a lot of growth, which means our problems are more difficult. And that's one of the reasons we're here. So this is a map from last year. People are always wondering, is China's growth rate 7.1? Well, if you're chasing growth like a pension fund manager that's got a growth component to your portfolio, you're going to go to the name of the top of the list. There's always been questions about. Regardless, it's very clear that the center of gravity economic activity is going this way, and we don't need to belabor that point anymore. Let's get to here. So we have these reports. U of M has a subscription to one of the first names in market research, and we pull a few of these periodically. This was what was this done? This was pulled in February. Probably I want to pull it again, but you can see what this organization does is it breaks up revenue and wages. So this is everything that's coming in for money, and this is for revenue. This is what's going out in labor. Professor salaries, custodians, security, electrical engineers, other managers of advocacy, such and so forth. So it appears as though we're growing at 2.3%. That's the education area. Let's see, let's look at another one. We put in public schools here. Public schools are noteworthy. I think this is reflecting a demographic change. It's growing up. Annual growth, they make a growth projection here. I'm going to have to look at this. So annual growth, but annual growth from 9 to 14. Okay, so just recently this is contracted, and it looks like this is a going forward type of a number. So that's what public schools look like. And we'll just buzz through. This is private schools, a growth rate of 1.2 trillion. We start to accumulate the income and separate it from wages, as you'll see. And okay, this is community colleges. A very important part of making the community colleges, I don't mind saying, are a very important part of our educational system for smoothing out some of the lumpiness and how information gets transferred. So I'm a great supporter of them. For-profit universities, you can see that they're growing also. And what do we do here? So you take all those IBIS industry reports and you rack them all up and you separate revenue from labor, and you get a number, all costs after labor. So let's hang on to that number now, 453. Let's see what we can do with it. So that was, what was that? That was that was 2013. This is 2015. I probably need to update this a little bit. It's not a lot different. But long story short, you start to see about a 6% increase from, was it 2013? 2013 to 2015, which appears to be over 2 years, 3 times 3% annual growth over 2 years, roughly twice this growth in the gross domestic product. Of course, cost is going much larger than that. Again, more corroborating numbers. I want to let others. This is the time of year when there's the annual lament over the cost of college. So again, I'm trying to. This is the only discussion, by the way, that I know of that are looking over these numbers in any detail. So every month we hope we get a little bit better. We always invite our colleagues here. So again, looking at it from 30,000 feet, you can see what other nations are putting in over time on their on their educational system, what part of their gross domestic product. We use it 7.3 at the moment. What do we have next here? And also, this is an important number. Very often people need to discriminate between the gross domestic product, the size of the federal budget, the size of our industry. The federal budget at the moment is about 20% of gross domestic product. So this shows you how that, and what would that be? 3.6 trillion, roughly something like that. How would that 3.6 trillion be broken up? And as you can see, that a lot of transfer payments are made right in this area here. Education is way down here at, where's education? Here we are. I think roughly, so that number looks like the number we saw before. It's always helpful for what our estimates start to look. So these are the numbers that we use to just, I admit sometimes it's just best to work at 1.2 trillion for the size of our industry generally. And we just basically take 20% of that, which includes healthcare. Now remember, university affiliated healthcare systems are part of our number. And so that's why we use 300 billion. We know that for reasons we've covered elsewhere on our site and also on our video channel, the risk aggregations of university healthcare systems are important enough to include in our $300 billion number. Also another number I like to draw our attention to is, we've also covered this in the past, our energy cost is about 30 billion. So I know that one of the louder conversations in our industry is one that involves getting to a net zero campus. When I consider labor issues and administrative issues and what we perceive as excess there, I would think the energy issue is a very crowded space, and I wonder out loud right here if we're at the point of diminishing returns, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to innovate toward the net zero campus. I'm a friend of that also, but I'm not so sure how much money we're spending per year to get this number down. Suppose we get that number down 1% a year. That'd be 300 million. How much are we spending on all the different sustainability enterprises in our industry? It's a tough question to ask. That's a different teleconference. Let's move on. So again, we look for corroborating numbers. This is one of the lead names. Gro Agmon's one of our subscribers to our blog. We communicate with him with some frequency. He would like to attend at the very end. When the annual number is done, he'll probably be calling in. And so, but I'm using some of his numbers here. And this is what we've used. He looks at all of the different enterprises. I'm sorry that this might be a little bit blurry for you, but things like furniture, roofing, computers, lighting, all that kind of those components of our cost structure are in this number. So he had 242 billion in 2013. And where are we in 2014? It was, what was it? It was 313 billion. Okay, that number we're starting to see numbers accumulate around the 300 billion number. So that's why we try to say we educate our numbers. They're very large numbers. Joe's quick to say that when you talk to most C-suite executives in our industry, they struggle a lot with the $300 billion number. So there it is. Now, again, I try to rack this up and try to make some tangible comparisons. Again, this is the macroeconomic view we're looking at. We'll get to the micro in a minute. And so you can see that these are the larger companies that are supplying parts and energy to our industry. So United Technologies. These are all names that would show up on approved manufacturer lists. So, in light of the fact that I think Christine is off site, I'm going to assume that I'm going to spare her the time reminder. Usually when we are working on site, I get a clock, but I think I'll just march right through this. So, again, to emphasize where our $300 billion number is coming from, we listed all the components. I've also in the past used energy costs. This is probably a number I want to revisit, but there's numbers out there coming from the government about square footage energy consumption, and when you start to back these numbers out, and 8%, I use 10% just because it measures convenience, but a few blogs ago and a few teleconferences ago, we're actually spending less than 10% of our 300 billion on energy. So also, what else do we have here? I also used the University of Michigan here, and looking at this, one thing it's interesting to note, and it's not something that we're really driving into this number, but what we're seeing is that U of M's probably not alone in the fact that the university healthcare system is about 50% of our $6 billion budget. So it used to be fully half. I think it's more than half. So again, getting back to the university affiliated healthcare systems as being a component of our industry, we don't ignore it. We're still trying to get a little bit better numbers on it, but we still can get our work done, and these numbers help set our priorities. So, why is it important? So we try to remind this. I think we'd be a 200. We'd be a is a Fortune 2.5 company, larger than Chevron and smaller than Exxon. Now that's different. Now remember, this is different than our construction spend. It looks like a construction spend is something on the order of what would that be? 1/3, 1/4 of our annual facilities and operations spend. Okay, we'll run right through that. So let's look at the microeconomic view. I've been asked in the past, we've done this for a couple of years now, to explain what would this mean to a $50 million building. Let's see how closely I got. Suppose we're building a $50 million office building. That could be a classroom building. It turns out that offices and classrooms in higher ed only, are defined by a risk category. Whether you like it or not, whether or not the energy rules should be like at the ASHRAE 90-point rules, whether those rules for classrooms should really apply to occupancy classes that were informed by fire hazard, that's another discussion. But removing some of that noise out of the discussion, we picked a $50 million general office building, and we went and we broke down. These are numbers. People who are looking at bid tabs, are always looking at using those proportions. You'll see these proportions roughly in most new building construction projects. I bring this up because it allows us then to see where we might focus our efforts. And one of the areas, obviously, mechanical energy space is a very active space, so we see a lot of advocacy priorities put there because of what proposals that are made by ASHRAE, ASME, and all the other organizations and branding agencies that are advocating energy conservation. But also it tells us where we might want to spend some time. So a couple of years ago, we put this number out there, and now I'm getting back to how we started this call. And we said, well, let's go to an area where nobody would go. The sustainability folks certainly don't want to get to structural framing of laboratory buildings. So we have been tracking for some years some of the governing assumptions about how you would design any new building. When's the last time there was any movement in those standards? Well, there were some that claimed that they hadn't moved since 1928. So we felt that if that were true, that we might want to revisit some of the structural engineering rules of 1928. Even if those rules, even if gravity and the strength of materials had differed, we felt that the occupancies would have changed. And sure enough, we found that. We found an ally in the National Association of Home Builders. They seem to be leading the technical groups that will be trying to get a stronger correlation between the American Society of Civil Engineering, Structural Engineering rules, and the International Building Code. So when you do that, oh, by the way, let me get a little bit farther ahead so you can see what this all means. I want to show you that when you start racking up all these deductions, and we look at both how first cost would be changed, and then what we believe our best estimate of what the running cost would be. Let's go up here. There we go. Annual reduction in O&M. The black column here, by the way, black lettered column, is what we actually did. These blue columns here are what's in process. So what you've seen me do here is that we're likely going to be moving, and we won't be able to do it with any confidence until about at first 2018, and more likely closer to 2020, we would start to see greater rationalization. But it's just for laboratories, and remember that we're looking at a classroom building. One of the distinctions, or an office building, one of the distinctions that have been coming up in those conversations was the discussion of what is the difference between a light laboratory and a heavy research laboratory in a college or university that's doing heavy work, say in earthquake studies, and that might be a different type of approach. So I can't belabor that. Long story short, we feel fairly comfortable. We can't be confident, we're comfortable that we've done our best to try to drill down to see what the avoided cost opportunity. We're always careful to say avoided cost opportunities. We can't make architects and engineers do changes that they don't feel like they want to do. We can't make facility managers do anything they don't want to do. Looks like I got a typo there. But we know that we've changed the codes and standards, relaxed them, changed the prescriptive requirements if we couldn't make them performance requirement to a level that would take about 3.4% out of that building. Now remember, that first cost would change in a laboratory building. It may well be that we would see that change of $100 million laboratory building may have $1 million avoided cost if it would be designed according to new occupancy distinctions in an international building code. So that's a microeconomic view. We can really get deep down into that, but we're trying to keep this down to about a half an hour. So let's move on to the where else we want to be. Okay, so this is me saying this at some point for laboratory buildings, this number might be going down. So we may redo this for just laboratories at some point, but right now it seems that our industry is laying out office space more than other types of occupancies, and that's most relevant now. I'd be the first person to say I'd love to get some time to do it. Okay, so now when you rack it all up, you get what we call the Hansen chart, named after my colleague Lowell. And over time, you know, we started drilling down into this advocacy back in 2002. I've been on the NEC since about 1997. It took about 3 years for people to start listening to me, and so we were able to get these changes. Starting here, we really stepped it up and expanded it beyond the electrical discipline. So my colleagues from Evergreen State University, Richard Davis. In fact, I think he'll be doing a perspective article on our website about this very soon. What we now know is that this weekly test has not, to the best of our knowledge, this weekly test has not caused any undue hazard, any risk that we know of. Now, of course, the listeners are welcome to tell us what they think if there is other data on it, but nothing is coming back to us as activists in this committee to say that testing fire pumps once a month is riskier than testing fire pumps once per week. So we got them rolled out from week to month. That's a 72% cost avoidance there. Again, you're welcome to test them every week if you like, but what we did was we changed the rules so that you could test them once a month and still meet the standard of care. My colleague from Arkansas State University, David Handworth, got this one done. He and I collaborated on this one. I've collaborated with numbers, so add them all up, and that's what you get. And we think that gives an eye shot. We believe these are two areas here where I put these in gray so that you understand that they're not done yet, and we would expect them to show up in about 2020. They're going in our direction, but slowly as such things go. Let's take you here, and this is important. I'm not sure if I can actually get to this. So let's go over here to our website, and you can see where we try to rank the activity. Remember that we're in this business here. We believe that code writing and vote getting really is the essential currency of what we do. It's discipline, speed, and results. I guess this takes you back to our blog site, so let's just do that. And what we want to show here is if you assume that getting ideas in front of technical committees that are informed by data and simply coming up with a better idea, then who's putting most of the ideas on the table? So we've begun to track these, and this is across 4 different document suites: NFPA, ICC, ASHRAE, maybe not ASHRAE, largely NFPA and ICC is what we're picking this. So what this does reflect is obviously that this is our core competency, and we're following, and we would like to assist all of these other organizations in getting ideas out there. I know my colleague Dan Brimmer put this one out. I know my colleague Ryan Giorgio put this one out. We'd like to help them succeed in their proposals. Similarly, we've had discussions here about the degree to which trade associations are helpful to the implementation of our discipline. Here, you'll notice in today's blog, we've been following the Financial Accounting Standards Board, and we're watching NACUBO, and all of those organizations that are putting ideas in front of standards development committees we're tracking. So we want to make sure that we're accurate. We know in the early stages we're making some estimates, so our hope is that this information could be volunteered to us, but we have to get it to produce this ranking. Then we'll do that also. So let's get back, and I think we're getting pretty darn close to our end here. So that's where I wanted to take us with that. And finally, I guess we're coming onto our time limit, so I won't go. I would like to make some special recognitions for my colleagues. You'll notice on today's blog post that Keith McCowan has been active for a couple years in the Biosafety Cabinet Standard, NFPA 49, so he got some changes last time to reduce first cost. So this year it looks like he's got some what we call code wins in NSF 49 in the same standard. Christine Fisher, again, she's off site at the moment, and I'm grateful for the time she's able to spend struggling with that campus move-in traffic, and so she was able to call in and start our call, but I will be closing it on her behalf. Finally, two colleagues that were helping us with this rather difficult and subtle change, Nate Sosin out of I believe there's Thornton out of Chicago, and Mark Krieger from, I think, Janney. I regret I don't know their names. So this is both of these are global structural engineering firms, and they set us down the road and brought this to our attention about the prospect for right-sizing structural engineering rules. There's probably no other organization in our industry that builds so much that could actually assert this idea that we probably need to revisit some of those design assumptions going back 50 to 100 years. And do they match the kind of occupancy classes? You will find many structural engineers do not want to touch that stuff, and I acknowledge their concern. Our job here is to simply ask the question, and when we asked the question, we found many more people of like mind. So that's it. You could say that we are responsible for 3 to 4% of avoided first cost and significant O&M cost. We don't use a percentage on that one because it very differs by locality, but as you can see on our what we call our Robin chart, the microeconomic view, that it still is significant. It's on the order of 1 to 10%. You would think that that any of this would stop. You actually cannot stop. Billings are always changing, labor markets are changing, products are always changing. The regulatory landscape is changing. So I use this New Yorker cartoons to emphasize that point, is that regulation is a game played over and over again. And it's as we try to say, that a streaming regulation has to be matched with streaming advocacy. So, thank you very much for your time. Next week we'll be working